Before we begin, if true survival stories told from the inside matter to you, subscribe to the Story Beyond the Impact, tap like, and leave a comment to help us keep these voices alive. I didn't board BA 5390 expecting the past to take up residence in my chest. It was 10th of June 1990, Birmingham to Malaga, a Sunday with the sort of British sunshine that makes you forgive the week before. The aircraft was a BAC 111, compact, a bit noisy by modern standards, the kind of jet that smelt faintly of warm plastic and tea. We were a collage of holidaymakers and ordinary lives, mums juggling storybooks, a stag party already wearing sunglasses, me with a disposable camera, and a plan to turn a week by the sea into a promise for someone who'd grown tired of hearing me say, one day. Seat 3F. Right-hand window. From there I could see the curve of the nose, and when the cockpit door cracked open as someone squeezed past, a flash of instruments like a city at night. The cabin crew had that brisk kindness I've only ever found in the UK, efficient without making you feel processed. If you told me then that one of them would hold the captain's legs against the storm with his bare hands, I'd have laughed and asked what film you were pitching. We lined up, throttle, roll. The runway blurred into a silver ribbon, and we rose into a Midlands sky, polished clean by hope. The cabin did its normal ballet, belts off, trolley clatter, the first coffee gratitude that feels like absolution. I took out the camera, palmed it like a secret, and framed a wing against cloud, as if I could trap the right kind of blue for later. It was the sort of small theft from time that makes a life feel bigger. 17 minutes after takeoff, give or take, time goes funny when it breaks. The world banged. Not a gentle cough of turbulence, not a dropped pan in the galley, a detonation of air. The pressure punched the length of the fuselage, and every sound learned a new volume. The cockpit door burst open and slammed back on its hinges. Papers leapt like startled birds. An unholy scream of wind took the language out of the room. I saw it. We all did who were seated forward. The windscreen on the captain's side had gone, not cracked or spidered, but gone, and he, the man flying us, was no longer in his seat, but pinned to the window frame, upper body forced into the blue by the vacuum of our own speed. His feet were in the cockpit, the rest of him was outside, his tie whipped like a metronome for a song you hope you never hear again. The first officer. I learned his name later, but to me in that moment, he was a human being made of decisions, had both hands on the controls and a jaw set to the business of not dying. He forced the nose down into a descent we could survive, oxygen hissing into masks, engines howling their protest as the BSC 111 tried to be all its own weight and the sky at once. A flight attendant, Nigel I'd learn, threw himself into the cockpit and grabbed the captain's belt. Another braced his legs. "Hold him!" someone shouted, and we did. By we, I mean the cabin itself, the shared intention that becomes a crew when life demands it. Time did the thing trauma always makes it do. It stretched and snapped, tick and tock no longer in conversation. I remember the smell. Cold air, hot plastic, a ghost of metal, and the way my hands shook even as I reached for the camera that had seemed, minutes before, a toy. The wind made speech ridiculous, but I heard myself say, stupidly, "Is he?" because I couldn't bear to finish the sentence. A steward's eyes found mine, the kind that tell you the truth by refusing to nod. Hold. That was the instruction written on every face. We descended because there was no other gospel. The FO flew a profile you could draw on the back of a receipt. Aviate, navigate, communicate in that order, but with the volume turned up until the words shook. In the rows, some people prayed, some clutched hands they'd never held before, some sat very still, as if stillness could please God. I did the one thing that felt like control. I watched the behavior of the aeroplane the way you watch a loved one's chest, up, down, alive, alive. In the madness of noise, a thought cut through. No one asked me to help. I could pass water. I could hold a stranger's shoulder down to the seat in front of me during the worst of the shuddering. I could stay out of the aisle. But the real work was being done in a tunnel of air and frost by people who had pledged themselves to this sort of day long before we'd bought tickets. Fear tried to make me bigger than I was. Discipline kept me small enough to fit in my seat and do as I was told. Then the world shifted from scream to instruction. The nose came level. The wind remained a monster, but a caged one. We were headed for Southampton, I would learn, because it was there and long and ready. The intercom spat words in tatters. Emergency, descending, prepare. I looked at the camera in my lap and hated it for being what it was. Proof waiting to be made. I slid it into the seat pocket as if it had teeth. What I will tell you now, decades later, is that the flight did more than land. It made us. In those minutes, when the cockpit was a storm and the cabin an answer, we became witnesses not to horror, but to craft. We were passengers, yes, but also a congregation to a liturgy that ended with tires kissing tarmac and the sort of silence that makes you forget noise ever existed. We stopped, we lived, and before any of us knew what the papers would call it, we understood that something had been seen that should not be shown. Not because it would hurt the airline or absolve anyone, but because it would wound a man already hurt enough. It was there, standing in a pool of June light filtered through British cloud, that we began the pact we never named. I didn't know then that keeping a promise could weigh as much as a human body held against a storm. They took us off the aircraft into a world that looked the same as the one we'd left. Aprons, stairs, high-vis vests, but felt morally altered, as if someone had turned up the contrast on what decency should look like. The captain was carried past on a stretcher, blue lips, frost-burned skin, eyes closed but life present, and the room did what rooms do when faced with a man who has just spent 20 minutes half outside an aeroplane. It went reverent. The first officer, face drawn into a map of decision fatigue, disappeared into the machinery of the day that still had to be done. Statements, checks, the unglamorous paperwork of having saved a cabin full of hearts. In a side room with cheap carpet and the smell of tea, we collected ourselves. Some wept like it was a sport. Some stared at their hands as if the truth were written there. A woman asked to ring her mum and borrowed my coins. I watched a crewman, the one who had held the captain's belt, lower himself into a chair with the slow care of someone teaching his body how to sit again. He looked at his palms as if they were strangers. He would later be called brave by people who prefer their bravery named. In that room, he was simply a man who had done something hard because it needed doing. The camera in my pocket weighed more than any metal I'd ever carried. It was a cheap thing, a rectangle of potential cruelty. I hadn't pressed the shutter in the gale, it hadn't even occurred to me, but another passenger had. I saw it in the tremor of his hands, the way he turned the little wheel to advance the film as if it might say no out loud. He wasn't a villain. He was human, trying to make sense of an impossible view. Still, the idea of that image leaving the grammar of our small kingdom and entering the permanent tense of print felt like a second emergency. We didn't vote. We didn't stand and make speeches. The pact began with eyes, the way survivors recognize one another without ceremony, and continued with actions at the scale of cups of water and tissues and shoulders offered. The man with the camera sat, breathed, and then said, "I don't think these should exist." He looked at me as if I might contradict him and rescue his curiosity from its conscience. I didn't. I said, "Then they won't." The steward, the one whose muscles had kept our captain from becoming a story you tell with a lowered voice, saw the camera. He didn't reach for it. He asked, "May I?" His hands were steady now. The passenger passed the camera like a confession. The steward slid the little plastic back open with a fingernail and pulled the film free. He asked for a cup, filled it in the loo, and in front of us all unspooled the negatives into water until the images blurred into a black ribbon of nothing. No drama, no symbolism, just the plain work of mercy. No one applauded. We watched as if a life were being washed. And then the steward handed the empty camera back and said, You did the right thing." The man nodded, a small, relieved collapse of shoulders, and I realized the Pact had unwritten clauses. We would protect the dignity of those who had saved us. We would not feed the hunger of headlines with a stranger's face in extremis, and we would, if asked, tell the truth in a way that didn't make anyone a prop. We stayed until they'd found us rooms, buses, alternatives to the day we thought we were living. In the corridor, a journalist waited, doing the necessary work of turning events into news. "Did you see him outside the cockpit?" he asked. Eyes kind, because good reporters are decent more often than people think. I said, "I saw people hold," and left it there. He could have pressed. He didn't. Mercy is contagious when you give it a place to sit down. Later, when the country woke to the story, the names would become public. Captain Tim Lancaster alive against expectation. First Officer Alistair Atchison lauded for flying a brick through weather as if it was silk. Cabin crew named in the same breath as the word hero. The AAIB would investigate. The wrong bolts would have their day in court of cause and effect. Procedures would be rewritten with ink that doesn't fade. All of that was above my certification level. My license allowed me one thing: to keep a promise made without a hand to shake on it. The years did what they do, stacked themselves. I moved house, I married, then didn't. I worked too much, then learned better, then forgot. The story became something I took out in quiet rooms, a way to teach myself what craft looks like under pressure and what silence can mean when it's elected, not imposed. Sometimes I'd wake at 3 a.m., with the scream of wind in my ears, and press my palm to a bedroom window to remind myself it was still there, that glass could hold. And then, decades later, an email arrived in a Sunday inbox grown lazy with newsletters and discount codes. A subject line that tasted of old metal, seeking participants, documentary on BA 5390. The body of the message was polite, reverent, full of the right words about context and respect. A line near the end: "We've obtained images from that day and would value your account to frame them responsibly." Images. I read the word as if it might cut my lip. I wrote back something non-committal and decent: "Happy to talk, many feelings, needs care," and then I sat very still. Either somewhere some other camera had worked, or someone had kept a copy from the bath we'd made in that side room. Or this was a bluff to coax a story out of a stone. Whatever it was, the Pact that had lived quietly in my ribs woke like a bird that had mistaken winter for safety. I rang one of the people I still knew from that day. Strange, the friendships you keep from singular moments. And we met in a cafe near Southampton because geography has a sense of humor. We spoke in the present tense about a past that refused to move. He had had the same email. We watched steam rise from mugs and made a choice. We would tell the truth again, but we would do it together. And if the images existed and insisted on being seen, we would witness them without letting them turn anyone into a spectacle. That night, I opened a drawer and found the notebook where I keep the keys to doors I don't know I'll need. Inside was a scrap of paper I'd torn from a magazine and used as a bookmark on days when I had to be brave for smaller reasons. I wrote 3 lines under it, the way I did in 1990, without knowing it would be a habit that saves me. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. The Pact didn't end in a sink. It carried on in the way we would tell the story now. Not with gore or gasp, but with the engineering of choices, the mathematics of mercy, the arithmetic of doing the decent thing when no one is marking your homework. And still, if I'm honest, a part of me feared what a picture could steal. Not the truth. Truth survives photographs. Dignity. Dignity can be thinned by pixels until a man becomes content. We had kept him a person. Could we do it again, in an age that measures attention in seconds and profits in clicks? The answer would arrive with a knock I knew I'd eventually hear, a camera crew in the doorway, lights respectful, voices low, Britain outside being busy with its own ordinary miracles. "We'd like your account," they said. "On your terms." I looked at their kit, at the way a lens turns a face into a story, and heard again the wind that stole our sentences. "All right," I said, "but before we begin, you need to know about a cup of water and a roll of film." If this story moved you, write in the comments, "moving story" or "touched my heart." I'll be reading. The production office lived above a florist in a street that smelt of rain and eucalyptus. Britain was doing its usual weather, deciding between 3 seasons an hour, when I pressed the buzzer and heard my own name echo back as if the building wanted to be a witness. Inside, soft carpets that ate footfall, posters for documentaries with serious fonts, and a bowl of boiled sweets that had turned into small glass stones with age. The producer was younger than the story. He shook my hand with reverence and an anxiety that belonged to deadlines. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if I were a rare book someone had decided to take out of the library. He talked first, always the way with people who pull threads for a living. "Care, respect, context," he said, as if laying out instruments on a surgical tray. He had done his homework. Dates, flight number, the names, Captain Tim Lancaster, First Officer Alistair Atchison, Nigel Ogden, and the crew, spoken cleanly, not as sound bites. He even said Bassi 111 correctly, which impressed me more than it should have. Then he turned to the window and admitted it. "We've been offered images, a few stills taken in the cabin. We want to handle them responsibly or not at all." Images. That word again. A blade in a velvet pouch. I watched a blue tram snake past in the street and remembered the side room with the faux wood chairs, the cup of water, the ribbon of negatives blackened into mercy. "We washed them," I said. "At least one roll," he nodded. "We think there was another." My throat thinned to a wick. Of course there was another. There are always 2 of everything on days like that. Fear and courage, noise and signal, 1 roll saved and 1 spared. He slid a paper across, a consent form but also a confession. Their source was one of us, a passenger whose email address still did the thing British names do when they flirt with Oxford commas and parish registers. I recognized it, not the letters, the posture, the kind of man who writes careful emails and kept careful silence for 30 years until a story tapped on his door like a census taker. I had his number. Goose Bay had taught us to exchange more than pleasantries. "We won't use anything without permission," the producer said. And I believed him. But permission is not a legal box. It's a moral instrument that squeals if handled wrong. "Before we even look," I said, "we need him in the room. And I want another seat at the table, someone who knows our machine, a pilot, not to romanticize it, to translate." He nodded like a man grateful for a checklist. That afternoon I rang Tom, the friend from Southampton, the one who had cried twice in 3 decades and both times because of wind. We met on a bench near a marina where the smell of diesel acts like smelling salts for memories. I showed him the email. He breathed out a paragraph without words. "We promised," he said. I said, "We promised to protect dignity, not erase evidence." He winced because the word had a courtroom echo. "What if the picture teaches?" I asked. "What if a young tech sees the cost of the wrong bolt and never makes that mistake? What if a trainee hears the wind in his head and understands why you don't give up the human longhand when the glass goes loud?" Tom watched a gull negotiate a chip with the sea and looked tired enough to be honest. "And what if it becomes content?" he said. "A clip at 1.25x speed with comments switched off." We sat with that, because the future is not as good a listener as the past. We rang the man with the role. He answered on the second ring in a voice that still carried the cabin air of 1990. Polite, unassuming, built for cues and moral weather. We said our names and could feel his shoulders drop through the line. "I didn't sell them," he blurted. "I kept them so the day wouldn't pretend it was smaller than it was." He told us he'd never shown them, not to profit, not for shock, not even to himself sometimes. He kept them the way you keep a ring from a marriage that didn't last. Not because you want to wear it, but because it once told the truth about a promise. "I won't hand them to a stranger," he said, "but I'll bring them to you. If we decide together, or we destroy them like we meant to." We met 3 days later at the production office. The rain had chosen a single determined season. The producer had done the thing you do when you want to be serious. He'd made tea. Only Britain asks black leaves and boiling water to be witnesses. Our man arrived with an envelope fat enough to be dangerous and thin enough to be precious. He placed it on the table and didn't sit immediately, like a parent whose child is about to be examined. "Before we look," I said, "we need a pilot." The producer smiled. He'd invited one, a retired A320 captain with kind hands and a face lined by de-icing trucks and doubt. He introduced himself as Alan, and then did a thing I loved him for. He took the envelope and didn't open it. "Here's the procedure," he said, voice level the way a runway is level. "We set intent, we discuss criteria, then we view once, lightly, without freeze-framing. If it's too much, we stop. If it teaches more than it takes, we discuss next steps, which include consent from the people whose bodies are in the frame." He looked around the table as if checking harnesses. "Understood?" We all nodded like students in a cockpit we'd hoped never to sit in. Intent, criteria, consent, simple words that behave like guardrails when a story threatens to spill. We set ours with the care of people who knew how far this could slide. No faces without permission, no shock for shock's sake. Nothing that contradicts the investigations, nothing that calls heroism what was actually craft and duty. And then, because journalism requires spines, we added, "We will not pretend it wasn't visually extraordinary. We saw a man in the sky and we survived. The picture is not a sin, it's a sentence. We will treat it like grammar, not gossip." Alan slit the envelope with an engineer's neatness. Contact sheets, a handful of prints. He placed them on a lightbox and flicked the switch. The room became that specific kind of quiet you get only twice in a lifetime. In the second before a child is born, and in the second when a story shows you its most dangerous truth. There it was. The cockpit like a storm mouth, the captain's body pinned by its own profession, a crewman holding with the sort of strength that doesn't come with gym memberships, a blur of oxygen masks and paper confetti and hurricane air. No gore, no sensationalism, just the physics of a wrong bolt and a right decision cohabiting for a mercy of minutes. I felt my palms go cold, as if they'd pressed that window frame again. Tom made a sound that was not quite speech. The producer swallowed his career and said nothing. Alan exhaled and spoke the only sentence you want from a pilot at a time like that. "All right, we'll aviate, navigate, communicate. First, aviate. Are we okay in here?" He scanned us as if he had a cabin to land. We nodded. "Navigate. Does this move us toward the stated intent?" He looked at the photograph as if it were a coordinate. "Communicate. Who do we call?" We called the airline liaison first, not for permission to feel, but for a map through the proper rooms. Then we asked for a route to the captain, not to blindside him with his own image decades later, to ask, to explain what we thought the picture could do if held correctly, to offer him the dignity of choice. Days stretched while emails learned to be important. I carried the weight of a story that wanted to creep into the internet and become unstoppable. I walked the city listening for alarms that weren't there. I watched a gull balance on a lamppost and tried to learn something about grace. At night, when memory is hungry, I would revisit the frame in my head and force myself not to linger. Pictures are not rooms. You can't live in them without losing the depth of the world. So I'd run my personal checklist, name the fear, check the horizon, fly pitch and power. Then I'd add a fourth line that belonged to this new phase, get consent. The Pact had been about protection. Perhaps the adult version was permission. The call came on a Wednesday with the grudging kindness of British sunshine. We had our route. A meeting would be possible. There would be schedules to honor, boundaries to keep. We would bring the photograph only if asked. We would use words like teaching and context and respect and mean them. And we would remember every second that the image on our table was a man's life, at a moment when it could have stopped. I printed one sentence on a card and put it in my pocket like a lucky charm. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. It had carried me through wind and through decades of quiet. It would have to carry me through a room where history wore skin and shook hands. We were going to ask the sky's permission to speak about itself. Britain, outside the window, kept being ordinary. That felt like a blessing. We met in a room that had been a library once, corners that remembered whispers, a smell of paper and polish, a window that made the daylight into a rectangle you could step into if you were brave. Someone had thought to put water on the table. Someone had thought to remove the clocks. Britain is good at the practicalities of feeling when it decides to be. The airline liaison did introductions with the careful cadence of a head teacher presenting prize winners. This is Captain Lancaster. The name arrived like a key, turning a long-closed lock. He entered quietly, the way people do who know rooms will tip towards them, no matter how gently they step. Time had done its honest work. More lines, a different gait, a weathered humility that made you feel you were meeting not a headline, but a craftsman with hands you'd trust with anything. His eyes took us in and did a small human thing I hadn't expected. They apologized for the fuss of it all. As if surviving his job too publicly had been an inconvenience he was sorry to inflict on the rest of us. We didn't show the picture. Not yet. We showed our intent. We explained the pact, the side room, the cup of water, the ribbon of surrender, and the way time had looped back with an envelope. I told him about my seat 3F, about the corridor of wind, about the way the cabin had become a crew. The producer said, less than producers usually do. Alan, the retired captain, spoke like a colleague at a kettle. "We won't do this without your say-so," he said, "and if you ask us to bin it, we will." The captain listened with the attention of a man diagnosing a noise by listening to the whole airframe. He asked fair questions. Who took it? Why keep it? What would it add that the AAIB had not? Where would it live once released? And the most important, how do you keep it from becoming spectacle? We answered with paths and promises and a humility I hope didn't sound like performance. "We think it teaches," I said, "if we hold it properly. It shows what instruments can't, the cost on a body, the reality of a crew who were more than procedures. But it's your face in the more of it. If you say no, the answer is no." He sat back. The room didn't breathe. In the gap, I remembered a single detail from that day that had refused to fade. The way one of his shoes had caught in the frame and held, the sort of contingency engineers can't write into manuals, the sort of mercy you don't count on but receive like a sacrament. He must have known that too, that sometimes you live because the world makes a join where it might have made a seam. "All right," he said finally, voice low. "Let's see what we're talking about." We didn't put it on a screen. The Lightbox came out again, this time like an altar we refused to name as such. The print lay there, gentle in its obscenity, factual in its sorrow. He leaned in, and for a second I watched a man meet his own near absence. No flinch, a small tightening at the mouth, a nod that said, yes, that is the weather of that minute, that is the posture of a body trying not to be taken. He looked to the side where a forearm, Nigel's, was a rope made of flesh. He exhaled through his nose and said very softly, "Good hands." We spoke criteria again, but this time with him. He set boundaries like a professional sets minima. No close-ups of faces, no freeze frames on my body like a circus. Speak of the crew in complete sentences. Do not let the picture pretend this was luck. It was training executed under intolerable conditions. And put the investigation first. If you show the cost, show the cause. People should see the bolt as clearly as the bruises. Then he surprised me by giving us something unprompted, a gift shaped like a sentence he must have practiced in his own head for years. If a student learns to respect a checklist because he's seen this, then perhaps the picture earns its keep. Consent is not a switch, it's a course. But we had a heading now. The liaison, keen to turn feeling into structure before it could become a runaway, suggested a plan. A segment where the image appears briefly, framed by context, preceded by warning, followed by voices that refuse to be lurid. Alan added, "You also show the after, the hospital, the recovery, the return to flying. Machines and men mend." The captain almost smiled, some more neatly than others. We never asked him if he wanted a copy. We didn't offer the insult of thinking he'd put it on a mantelpiece, but we asked if he wanted to dictate the caption. He shook his head. "Tell the truth," he said. "Use my name as lightly as you can, while still giving the crew their due." Then he turned to me, this stranger who had once been 24 rows and a lifetime away, and asked a question I'll carry like a medal made of paper. "Do you want this?" he said. "You made a promise once." I thought of the cup of water, of the man unspooling a ribbon of silver into the sink until pictures turned to ink, of the feeling shared and wordless that we could protect a dignity that hadn't asked to be public. "I want us to keep the promise," I said, which was never to look away. It was to look well. He weighed that and gave a single pilot's nod, a decision collapsing into a single degree of movement. The producer, who had been so careful to be quiet, cleared his throat like a person coming back into a room he'd left on purpose. "We can shoot next month," he said, tentative, eyes on the captain, as if proposing a go-around. "We'll keep the frame on screen for 3 seconds. We'll blur faces. We'll lead with cause and follow with craft. And we won't use it in social clips." The last line in 2025 is a vow like no other. The captain considered the century we live in and said, "Hold yourselves to it." When it was done, when the lightbox was off and the picture back in its envelope like a bird we'd decided not to keep, we stood in that British way that means goodbye has arrived, but no one wants to bruise it. We shook hands that had done work. At the door, the captain paused. "Thank you," he said. "Not for asking me, for asking the right questions." Then he was gone, and the room felt like a runway after wheels, full of the heat of what had just happened and already cooling. Outside, London continued without looking up. Buses committed to timetables, pigeons negotiated treaties with sandwich crusts, a street performer tried to make fire behave. We walked to the corner in a little procession of fatigue and relief. Tom squeezed my shoulder, the way strangers do at funerals when they have found the right pressure for presence. On the train home, I watched the country unspool, terraced houses, allotments, small back gardens with trampolines that are really declarations of childhood. I held the envelope as if it were made of mercury. In my pocket, the card with my checklist, soft at the edges from being handled. Listen to everything, believe behavior, decide human. We had done that, at least for one meeting. Now we had to do it for the cut, the voiceover, the choices that happen when rooms get hot and schedules loud. When my stop came, I stood and felt the day settle into me like a landing you can be proud of. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt in service, to a crew, to a promise, to a version of the truth that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. At home, I placed the envelope in a drawer and wrote a single line in my notebook, in block capitals, like a warning light that refuses to be background. Dignity before drama. We had broken the seal, but not the pact. We had found a way for the picture to live without making the man in it a relic. And still, I knew the hardest part would be next, telling the story so the audience learned to listen the way we had just learned to ask. TV studios smell like coffee and electricity. Ours was tucked behind a brick courtyard where smokers turned anxiety into weather. Inside, a rough cut on a monitor, a mound of notes, and a whiteboard with the 3 words I'd asked them to write, large enough to outshout ratings. Dignity before drama. Alan, our retired captain, took the seat nearest the sound desk. Tom sat beside me, elbows on knees like a goalkeeper before a penalty. The editor rolled the timeline. Slate, calm voiceover. Establishing shots of Birmingham in 1990, the color of old photographs, even when filmed yesterday. Then the AAIB diagrams, the cold comfort of line drawings that name bolts and loads and margins. We were building cause before cost, exactly as agreed. My interview came next. It was strange watching myself explain the moment the wind took the sentence out of the cabin. On screen, I was careful, almost surgical, about verbs. You don't say the captain flew out. You say was forced partway through the window frame. Precision is mercy. Half an hour in, we reached the image. The editor froze the frame instinctively, like anyone who works with pictures. The room flinched. No freezes, I reminded, soft but steel. We let it play at real time. 3 seconds, blurred faces, the caption a sober strip of text. Cockpit damage during explosive decompression, captain being held by cabin crew, aircraft descending under control. No adjectives, no music flaring its opinions, only the weather of that minute and the facts of craft. Even so, my stomach lit like a warning panel. A picture pulls you by the collar. I watched Alan, not the screen. He measured the moment like approach. Attitude, rate, runway remaining. Okay, he said finally, you've left the human in the picture, not under it. The producer exhaled the way people do when they've been breathing in for a week. Then the notes began. The way edits always become a chorus. Legal flagged consent language we'd need on screen. Comms asked for a shorter promo. The social team, good people, clever, living in a century that pays them to be fast, floated a cut-down where the image would be teased with a tasteful blur. Alan shook his head before I could. You will make content out of a man's worst minute, he said, not unkind, just incontrovertible. We promise no social clips. The producer backed us, a captain with the Czech airman in his ear. No socials, he said into a room that counts clicks like fuel. We'll fill the trailer with voice and diagrams. If we can't sell context, we don't deserve it. We built an ethics edit the way you build a non-precision approach, step-down fixes, stable by the threshold. The image would appear once, bracketed by investigation and training, wrong bolts, wrong torque, maintenance culture, cockpit resource management, and the cabin crew's muscle and mind. We recorded my VO line 3 ways and chose the plainest. You are looking at the cost of a mistake and the result of discipline. We cut a sequence where the camera lingered on the torn rubber seals because it made the picture feel like a crime scene. It wasn't. It was a work site in a storm. Then came the Pact, not as a confession, not as a boast, but as history. We filmed the story of the side room, the cup of water, the film washed until truth became ink. We did not name the man who had kept a second role. He had given us permission to use the image, not to assign him a sin. Keep him ordinary, he'd said on the phone. We all were. The hardest part wasn't the picture, it was the music. Scores are the slyest editors. We tried a cue in a minor key, strings like cold hands on your neck. The room recoiled. It changed the picture into tragedy instead of test. We tried silence. It made the image louder than truth. In the end, we chose air. A bed of wind recorded in a hangar, shaped so quietly you'd only miss it if it were gone. It didn't tell you what to feel. It told you where you were. As the cut firmed up, the century we live in knocked. A tabloid rang the press office, polite, apologetic, hungry. They had heard about a never-before-seen photograph. The liaison held the line we'd agreed, context or nothing. Meanwhile, in our smaller world, the Pact rumbled. A survivor I'd not seen since 1990 emailed a paragraph more wounded than angry. You're breaking what we kept. I invited him to the screening for survivors and crew. No PR, no press, just the people with a right to be first. He came, sat back row, arms folded like a crosswind. We ran the film in a room with curtains and tea, hands shook around paper cups in that British way we call composure. When the image passed, 3 seconds, blur in place, caption honest, the back row man stood and walked out. I followed, heart a landing flare held too long. "We washed a film to protect dignity," he said in the corridor, not unkindly, just tired. "What are we doing now?" I answered without defending myself. "We're protecting meaning. We're trying to keep it from becoming a myth that teaches nothing." He stared at his shoes, like they might offer a verdict. "If the captain's all right with it," he said, "I can be nearly all right. Sometimes that's the biggest consent you get." The last fight arrived disguised as formatting. The broadcaster wanted a countdown bumper before each ad break. Standard practice, harmless most nights. But placing a sting right after the image would turn a human moment into an act break. We rerouted the structure so the picture landed far from commerce, then stayed with rigorous process. Checklists on screen, a diagram of the pressurization system, a cut to the crew drills. The ad break came where our hearts could afford to step away. The broadcaster agreed, a rare kindness from a schedule that usually eats principle. On the penultimate day, someone leaked a still, not ours, into a private aviation forum. It spread like oil. In an hour, it was on 2 accounts with usernames that sounded like pubs. The faces were unblurred. My stomach went hollow. The liaison went to work. Takedown notices flew. The accounts apologized with the sincerity of people who have discovered consequences. We called the captain before he saw it elsewhere. "We're on it," the producer said. "It's already smaller than it was," I added truthfully. The captain's reply should be printed on procedures cards for the internet age. "Do your checks, then fly your plan." That night I couldn't sleep. The ventilator on my building's roof sounded like a Pact fan. I got up, made tea in the dark, and opened my old notebook, the one that had traveled with me from 1990 to now, its edges rounded by hands. I wrote a new line beneath the old 3. "Hold the center when the weather shifts. Editing is weather. Ethics are the center." We locked picture. Legal signed. The broadcaster scheduled. The tabloid offered money we didn't take for access we wouldn't grant. And in the small space where a promise lives, our strange little crew, survivor, friend, pilot, producer, touched hands without touching them and agreed to do the most radical thing you can do with a story in 2025, tell it slowly. The night before transmission, I visited a church I don't belong to, the kind with candles prepaid by other people's hopes. I didn't pray. I set my palm on the cool stone and treated it like a fuselage, metal that carries us when the air is unkind. "Listen to everything," I said under my breath, a checklist whispered to nobody and to everyone. "Believe behavior, decide human." Then I went home and tried to sleep between the seconds. The night the program aired, Britain felt smaller in the way television makes it. One room made of many rooms, the nation's hum tuned to the same frequency. Friends texted pictures of their screens. I put my phone face down and let the BBC voice carry us in. Not the channel we were on, but the cadence we borrow when we want trust. Alan watched from his kitchen, he'd promised, with a mug and a pen like a pilot, even on the ground. Tom sat beside me again, the way he had in the edit, the way we sometimes sat in the airport in 1990, pretending waiting was a profession. The film did what we had told it to do. It walked, it didn't run. It named the bolts before the bruise. It let the image pass like a weather front, there and then gone, leaving understanding rather than shrapnel. In living rooms across the country, people saw 3 seconds of a man being held to the world by human hands, and then saw why. We cut to checklists, to diagrams, to a young technician speaking about torque values with reverence, to a senior cabin crew trainer demonstrating the brace their body still remembers on winter nights. My phone began to vibrate with messages that sounded like breathing out. "Thank you for not making it gore. My dad was online maintenance in the 90s. He's crying and proud. I never understood what crew resource management meant until now." Among the texts was one from an unknown number that simply said, "Good hands." TL. I stared at the initials until they made sense, then showed Tom. We didn't reply immediately, because some gratitude you sit with before you send it back. Of course, the internet behaves like air. It finds every hole. Those two unblurred stills, already shrinking when we last checked, flared as the program trended. A few accounts froze them and wrote captions in the language of shock. The liaison team moved like firefighters, hoses of polite legal language dousing where they could. The broadcaster issued statements. Most outlets respected the ethic. A few blinked and pulled the images down with apologies that read like drafts. You cannot undo a view, but you can refuse to multiply it. Amid the noise, the signal arrived. A flight school wrote that they'd added our 3 seconds to a classroom, not to thrill, but to anchor a lecture on fasteners, procedures, and humility. A junior AME in Glasgow DM'd, "I'll never look at a windscreen the same way," in a good way. A cabin crew candidate wrote that seeing Nigel's forearm had taught her more about her job than 1,000 motivational posters. The picture, held properly, was doing what we asked of it, teaching without taking. Then the call we had braced for, because good checklists include the line you hope to skip. The survivor from the back row. He didn't shout. It was decent, he said, the compliment British and exact. Still, when the frame came, my body remembered the wind. I told him mine too. "Will you sleep?" I asked. "Tonight?" "No," he said. "Tomorrow, maybe. In a week, likely." We left it there, honesty as a sort of aftercare. Not every message was generous. One accused us of sanitizing heroism. Another said we had exploited trauma. Both stung. Both contained fragments of a truth we'd argued in the edit. I wrote replies I didn't send, then a reply I did. We showed what happened and how it was survived. We tried to keep the camera's appetite on a leash. Some people argued for argument's sake. Others came back with a softer second message hours later. "Watched again with my dad. You're right about the checklists." The next morning, the tabloids, who had been held at arm's length for once, surprised me. Headlines leaned into craft, not carnage. One ran a sidebar on maintenance procedures that would have made our engineer blush. Radio 4 invited Alan for a segment that was actually a lesson. He spoke without poetry, which is how you know a pilot is saying something he once remembered. Instruments can argue. The airframe tells the truth. Trust behavior. Train for the day you hope never comes. Listeners wrote in with the sort of gratitude that makes daylight feel like a clean window. And then, mid-morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't have the courage to save under a name. I answered like a first officer on a bad day, steady voice, eyes already scanning. "Hello." The line carried a quiet you learn on flight decks and in hospitals. "It's Tim," the voice said, as if we were old friends late for lunch. I stood up without meaning to, as if posture could respect a call. "We kept the frame small," I said, apology braided into information. He let the sentence land. "You kept it honest," he replied, "and you kept it useful. That's more important than small." He told me he'd watched with his family, that the image had felt like an old weather passing through the room, unpleasant, instructive, finite. "I've lived with that minute longer than anyone," he said. "If it can keep another minute from happening, I can live with 3 seconds more." We were quiet together. Then I said the only words that mattered. "Thank you for letting us ask." He chuckled, the sound of a man who can laugh with the thing that almost took him. "Thank you for asking." After the call, I walked to the park where London dresses like trees and teenagers practice being myth. I sat on a bench and watched a plane draw a line across the blue. For the first time since the envelope, my body didn't tighten when a contrail appeared. The sky had been loud for months. Now it was simple again. A father taught a child to ride a bike without stabilizers, running behind, one hand on the seat, letting go for 3 seconds, then catching, then letting go for 5. You could write a whole training manual from that bench. In the days that followed, smaller aftershocks rumbled. An American network asked to license the footage. We declined unless they agreed to our guardrails. A podcast wanted the uncut interview. We said no, because cutting is care, not censorship. The museum at Brooklands asked for a still to display, beside an explanation of windscreen design. That we approved, with the blur, with the caption, with a plaque about the cup of water. If the image is going to live anywhere permanently, let it live in a room that teaches engineering and ethics side by side. At home, I filed the emails under a folder called Pact, kept. I slept as if someone had turned the cabin lights to dim for crews. When I woke, the first sound in my kitchen wasn't wind. It was the ordinary click of the kettle, acknowledging its job. I poured tea and wrote the final line on the card I've carried since 1990, the card that has grown patient with edits. Share carefully, or not at all. Then I tucked it back in my wallet, where it rests behind my ID like a second identity. I thought we were done, but stories, like aeroplanes, prefer journeys to full stops. Another email pinged, this one from a young engineer in Toulouse. Her team had watched the film together. "I've been arguing for a boring change to a checklist," she wrote. "Your 3 seconds got me the vote." I read it twice, then sent it to Alan, to Tom, to the producer, to the man who had once kept an envelope the way some people keep a promise. For the first time, the image felt like not just a cost we had to bear, but a tool we had chosen to use gently. That evening, walking home past terraced houses and the ordinary opera of Britain being itself, I looked up again. Another contrail. Another promise on its way somewhere. I didn't whisper a prayer. I whispered a procedure. We hadn't made the past smaller. We had made it useful without turning it into bait. That, I decided, is what survival looks like when it takes the long way home. They invited us to a training hangar the week after broadcast, the kind of place that smells of kerosene and exams. Rows of windscreen assemblies sat on trestles like stern faces. A young engineer in a blue polo tapped one frame and said, almost tenderly, "This is where boring keeps you alive." She walked us through fasteners, torque values, washers that look like jewelry until they forget their job. No violins, just procedures that don't care if you're tired or clever. I touched the rim where glass meets metal and felt a shiver of old weather. The engineer noticed. "You were there," she said, not as a question. "We watched your film in class." She didn't say picture. She said film, the way you talk about something that taught you instead of entertained you. "It made a debate easy," she added. "We chose the checklist that takes longer." In a briefing room, an instructor, grey hair, squared shoulders, rolled a slide that was nothing but words. Humility, redundancy, pause. He told a story about a night shift, a misthreaded bolt caught because somebody read the manual out loud like prayer. "The day you think you can do it by feel," he said, "is the day you borrow trouble from the sky." On my way back through the hangar, I met a crew I hadn't expected. Nigel and 2 colleagues from that Sunday in 1990. Time had written its opinions on them, but their hands still looked like verbs. We found a quiet corner between an APU on a stand and a trolley of tools. "How's the arm?" I asked before I could stop myself. He flexed, shrugged. "Knows when it's raining," he said, and grinned like a man who has made peace with weather. We spoke without ceremony about holding a captain by a belt while the world tried to turn him into air. He said the thing I hadn't been brave enough to ask. I wasn't brave. I was busy. The sentence landed like a manual rewritten in a single line. Busy is repeatable. Brave is a miracle. Busy is what you can train. Before we left, the instructor asked if I wanted to sit in a mock cockpit. No switches live, just seats, yokes, a view painted on a wall. I slipped into the left, then moved to the right because that's where survival had sat that day. I looked at the shape of the window and didn't flinch. Nigel leaned on the doorframe. "The thing you did on telly," he said, keeping the picture small. "That was holding too." I nodded, because any answer would have spilt. That night, on a late train, the carriage lights hummed like pack fans, and the rhythm underfoot found the old checklist in my pocket. I added a line with a dull pencil. "Choose boring. Boring wins. The next page held a name I'd avoided writing all these years, Tim, and below it the words he'd texted after the program, "Good hands." I closed the book and watched my reflection share a window with the dark. In the days that followed, ordinary life kept presenting tiny cockpits. A meeting full of contradictory inputs. I chose the heading, slowed the approach, landed on time. A doctor's appointment where a monitor beeped a number that didn't match how I felt. I trusted behavior, not the drama of a single display. A family argument climbing into crosswind. Aviate, navigate, communicate. None of it was heroism. All of it was busy. A letter arrived on paper, rare now, precious for being slow. The museum at Brooklands sent a copy of the plaque beside the blurred still we'd approved. Engineering text, a paragraph about mercy, one line about the cup of water. I read it standing up in the hallway, coat half on, and felt something in me choose a softer word than closure, continuance. The story wasn't over. It had simply joined a set of shelves where other people could reach it without falling. On Sunday, I walked to the end of the runway fence at an airport too small to hold our old BAC 111, but big enough for arrivals that remember how to flare. Families pressed noses to chain link. A boy counted seconds between touchdown and reverse like a liturgy. A jet came in clean, a textbook of light and mass bored into safety by discipline. As it rolled past, I raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, a salute to all the busy hands that had made it an uneventful afternoon. The wind lifted off the grass and carried nothing dramatic, which felt like a gift. I stood there a long time and let boring win. We did one public screening by choice at a small cinema with bad coffee and good acoustics. Survivors sat among strangers. Engineers took the aisle seats. Someone in a captain's hat came without irony and left with less of it. After the credits, the house lights lifted and the moderator asked for questions. A hand shot up, young, certain. "Why keep a secret for decades?" she asked. "Isn't sunlight the best disinfectant?" The room leaned toward me. I didn't reach for poetry. "We didn't hide truth," I said. "We protected dignity. We kept a man from becoming content, and we told the story whenever it could teach. Secrets rot. Stewardship doesn't." The word surprised me as it left my mouth. It fit the shape of what we had done. A man with an engineer's badge asked what I'd learned that isn't on a diagram. "That busy beats brave," I said, and watched heads nod like metronomes. A crew trainee asked if fear ever leaves. "No," I said. "It takes a seat, belts in, and shuts up when work begins." Then, from the back, a voice I knew by its cadence, the man with the envelope. He stood without theater. "I kept a picture because throwing it away felt like lying about the size of the day," he said. "We used it because pretending it didn't exist felt like cowardice. We used it carefully because turning it into a trophy would have been cruel." The room exhaled the way rooms do when somebody says the thing everyone was circling. Afterward, in the foyer, people queued not for selfies, but for sentences. A young woman in high-vis, grease under her nails, told me she'd argued for a second sign-off on a task because of our 3 seconds. "It'll slow us," she said. "Good," I said. "Speed belongs to runways, not to checklists." An elderly couple thanked Nigel with the kind of sincerity that breaks your knees. He received it like he receives everything, as work completed. We ended the night at a pub that sells time by the pint. We took a corner table and let relief behave like laughter. Someone put a phone on the wood between us, and we all stared as if it might demand more story. It didn't. It just lit with small messages. "Thank you. Learned something. Good hands." Alan raised his glass. "To boring," he said. We drank to it like a toast to a saint. Walking home, the wind was up, the playful kind that steals hats and returns them. I felt it on my face and didn't jump to Greenland. I let it be London wind, bus warm, brick cooled, full of chip shop bravado. In my pocket, the card with my checklist had grown thin at the folds. I rewrote it on a clean one, the handwriting steadier than it had been in 1990. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. Choose boring. Hold the center. Share carefully or not at all. At my door, I looked up. A long haul banked lazily in the dusk, passing over rows of roofs that trusted it without looking. That, I thought, is the contract. Thousands of invisible actions so someone can ignore the sky and get the kids to bed. We had nudged that contract, not rewritten it, just underlined a clause. Dignity is part of safety too. Inside, the kettle clicked, like a master caution silenced correctly. I made tea and let the wind move around the house without moving through me. When I finally slept, the dream that came wasn't a cockpit torn open. It was a cup of water and a room where people chose the hard right over the easy wrong. I wrote to the past, the way you file a report after turbulence, calm, specific, no poetry unless it serves the truth. Dear me at 3F, I began, you'll be asked to decide what kind of witness you are. I told that younger self about the cup of water, about a ribbon of film turned to ink, about 3 seconds we chose to show carefully, so the next person doing night shift with a torque wrench would hear a small bell in their head and pause. I posted the letter to myself, because sometimes ritual helps the soul line up with the facts. On the way home, I detoured to the fence at a little airfield, where propeller training flights stitch patterns into the afternoon. A student went around, hands busy, instructor calm. Even from the grass, you could feel the discipline. No drama. Just a plan, renewed and flown again. The sight made me braver than any speech. Back at my desk, I drafted 2 more notes. One to Nigel, I kept it short. Thank you for being busy. The other to the first officer who flew us down that day. I didn't know if the address would find him. I wrote it anyway. You slowed the world, I said. I've been trying to do that ever since. Weeks later, a postcard arrived. A coastline, British weather doing 3 things at once. On the back, cramped pilot's handwriting, fly the plan. 2 words that feel like a handshake. The program's ripple reached places I'll never see. A trainee mechanic in Bristol messaged to say she'd argued for a second sign-off because our 3 seconds had taught her that boring wins. A cabin crew instructor sent a photo of a whiteboard. Humility, redundancy, pause. Under it, busy beats brave. I pinned the image above my kettle so I'd see it every morning when the day wanted me fast. Closure never arrived in a single envelope. It came as permission to let ordinary life be ordinary again. I took the train to Southampton and walked the perimeter of a runway I'd once wanted to kiss. The wind smelt of grass and jet fuel and chips from a van doing brisk trade. Families lined the fence. I watched landings, wheels, spoilers, reverse, like liturgy. Each touchdown looked like a sentence ending with a full stop. For once, I didn't translate the wind into memory. I let it be today. I thought of the Pact often, less as a law and more as a habit. Protect dignity, tell the truth, choose context over appetite. The internet is loud, we kept the center. There were moments I wobbled. A thread resurfaced with an unblurred still. A stranger asked for the raw. I kept repeating my small checklist until the temptation passed. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. Later, I found myself at a museum case holding a blurred version of the image beside an explanation of windscreen fasteners. A teenager read the caption aloud to a friend like it was a dare. Wrong bolts, he said. Right people. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't need to be. The sentence landed the way safe aeroplanes do. Enough. On the way out, I bought a postcard of a BAC 111 in British sunshine. At home, I propped it against a frame on my desk. Not a shrine, a reminder. On the back, I wrote the last line I'd needed all along. We didn't conquer fear. We gave it a seat and got on with the work. When I finally booked Malaga again, I chose a window on the right on purpose. Not to chase ghosts, to prove to my hands that glass can hold. As we climbed, I touched the sidewall and felt only the old language of lift. The cabin chime sounded, ordinary, civilized, and I smiled without testing it for omen. Seat 3F, I thought. You did all right. The sky outside was the same color it had been the day everything changed. Perhaps that's the point. The sky doesn't remember. We do, and we translate memory into procedures, kindness, and the stubborn decision to keep flying the plan. The call came from a school near Manchester. Would I speak to a class studying aviation and ethics? I almost said no. Then I remembered a gull balancing on a lamppost and a postcard that said, "Fly the plan." I went. The room smelt of whiteboard pens and ambition. I told the story not as spectacle, but as process. Pressure loss, resource management, a belt gripped by a pair of human hands, a descent flown by a mind that refused panic. A student asked, "What did you learn that's worth keeping?" I handed them my battered card. Listen to everything, believe behavior, decide human, choose boring, hold the center, share carefully, or not at all. This isn't poetry, I said. It's my checklist. They took photos of it the way pilgrims touch a relic, though it's only card and ink and a life that learned to be patient. On the train back, I watched England in panels. Brick, field, river, town, stitched by rails and weather. A contrail crossed the sky and I didn't tense. The program had aired, the picture had taught, the pact had held. Our inboxes had gone quiet except for the letters that matter. A maintenance manager saying a debate ended in favor of redundancy. A captain telling us a new cadet had quoted, "Busy beats brave in a sim." A quiet line from Tim, "Blue skies." 2 words that felt like a final hand on a shoulder. At home, I took the postcard of the 111 and slid it into the back of my notebook where old boarding passes live. I'm not superstitious. I am grateful. Gratitude keeps the weather inside your chest from turning nasty when the outside weather does what it likes. Not long after, I flew again. A night leg. London below like a spilled jewelry box, the cabin lights dimmed to nav. The captain briefed us on expected smooth air. The crew did their quiet circuit of belts and bins. I watched the wing write invisible equations and felt the simplest relief. Nothing to narrate. When we landed, brakes biting cleanly, I touched the window once, thank you, a habit now, and waited my turn to leave. By the door, I told the lead attendant that someone once saved my life by being busy. She smiled the way pros do when they accept praise as a cue to keep standards, not as a reason to bask. Every day, she said. On the jet bridge, the air smelt of rain and kerosene, Britain doing Britain. I loved it for being ordinary. This is the part where I'm meant to say, I healed. Healing isn't a finish line. It's a scan you run on yourself and the world. Check gauges, cross-check with behavior, fly pitch and power when the numbers argue. It's making time obey long enough to choose the decent thing. It's stewardship in a noisy age. So here's my final approach. Light, steady. We kept a promise made in a side room with a cup of water. We guarded dignity, we told the truth, and we used a hard image to make the world softer where it counts. Hands on tools, eyes on procedures, hearts on duty. If the sky ever roars in your ears the way it roared in mine, I hope you find yourself in the company of people who know how to turn fear into work. And if this story found you on a day when your own instruments argue, take my card for a while, stick it in your wallet. Read it in the queue, on the platform, at the gate. Listen to everything. Believe behavior. Decide human. Choose boring. Hold the center. Share carefully, or not at all. When the chime sounds, you'll know what to do.